Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One topic that Plutarch devotes a lot of attention to in his work, How to Tell a Flatterer from a Friend, is what the Greeks called parrhesia, which we can translate as frankness of speech, telling it how it actually is, being forthright, straightforward, honest with people that actually need it. And this would pertain most to friends, but could be to other people as well that you would have a friendly disposition towards. And as with so many things, it's easy to go a little bit overboard and misunderstand this. And Plutarch is going to deliberately adopt something like a notion of the virtuous mean. He'll actually mention virtue and opposed, that is, extreme vices. And he says that there's a big mistake that a lot of people make going from one extreme, that of flattery, which you want to avoid, to that of being unfriendly. And he talked about this earlier within the work. It's not just about whether we praise or criticize. It's also about pleasure and the lack of pleasure or painfulness or trouble. But when we turn specifically to frankness of speech, we're going to see that there's a tendency for some people to think that they're doing the right thing in just being kind of contentious or cantankerous or overcritical. And so he's going to talk about immoderate frankness. So the word there, ametria, he's using it in the dative, which is in this way conveying like how people go wrong. So by a lack of measure, this is the word that we get metrics from, right? Is the privative. So there's some measure, but you're going beyond the measure. By immoderate frankness, they end up destroying what gets translated here as a sort of friendly thoughtfulness. And there's other ways we could translate this. Tophilikon is one of the terms, kai kedemonikon, right? But it's a decent translation. We want to be cognizant of the friend who we're trying to impart some admonition, some criticism, some needed words to. And so he's going to tell us about the need for us to find, there's a lot of ways of translating this, the honorable or the right or even the beautiful, the fine. We need to hold on to this, literally to grab onto it, in the mean or out of. A little bit more literally, the mean, ektu metrio. So by engaging in frank speaking, by telling our friends, hey man, you're screwing up, but doing so in the right way, it'll be much more effective. It will perform its role, its duty, its office within friendship. If we go too far with it, or we do it in the wrong ways, then it's going to render that frank speaking not only less effective, but sometimes even offensive to the other person, which is not going to be helping them if that's indeed our goal. And so, this is how you can tell somebody who is a genuine friend from somebody who's just kind of a fault finder and jerk, right? So one of the things that he tells us is that we need to avoid giving the impression of partiality when we are slighted, parrhesia, or neglected, amalesthai. And malea is attention, care, concern, right? So when we feel like our friends are not attending to us, we shouldn't just be like, hey man, why don't you care about me? We should see whether this is a broader problem. So it's not just coming out of selfishness on our part. We should see whether they're doing this with other people. And we should say, hey, you are neglecting me, but you're also neglecting these people over here, or you're treating these people in a way that they shouldn't be treated. And he gives some examples of this in here that are illustrative, I think, of this. And so we could, easily compare this to our own contemporary life. If we want to say, you're not treating me right, we should think about whether this person who we are criticizing, admonishing, is treating other people right as well. And maybe bring that up. Then another really important area, and this gets discussed at great length, we should avoid being insulting. And there's a number of different ways that we could wind up being insulting while we are being a straight shooter, telling it how it is. So he says we need to purge away and eliminate from our frankness. And he uses 4 words here. So arrogance, hubris. This is a term that I think a lot of people know quite well because it made its way into English. So hubris is crossing lines, thinking that you're better than other people. So if you're criticizing somebody, you shouldn't be putting on airs. You also shouldn't be making them the butt of jokes, gelota, right? This is coming from the word for laughter. You don't want to turn them into something that is going to be lowered because you're making them the object of humor. Scoffing, scoma in this case. Scoffing is when somebody is, saying something and you're, that's that sort of thing. You actually see it in subtitles on TV shows now. There's a lot of different, let's call them non-verbal but communicated gestures that get transmitted as scoffing, right? And then scurrility, which is not a word that we use all that often, bomologian, which means a kind of joking around, but a low-class joking around, like calling somebody, hey, jackass, or something like that, right? We should avoid that. Why should we avoid that? Because it's not going to help our case when we're trying to steer somebody towards seeing that what they're doing is wrong and that they should be doing something better. He calls this the unwholesome seasoning of free speech. And this is interesting. The term there is hedusmata, right? This is coming from the word for pleasure. Something that's pleasant for us, maybe also for the audience, but it's not pleasant for that person who is encountering it. Ponera, it's bad, it's wicked, it's rotten, you could say. So we want to avoid this. He tells us that frankness does actually have room for tact, a sense of proportion. Doesn't mean that you can't joke around at all, but your joking should be, you could say, gentle. So he says, parrhesia deketai, it has room for, it admits of, it welcomes. To epidexion, kai to asteion. Now, asteion is often translated as urbane, not a term that we use an awful lot in English these days. Civil, I think, is something that covers a similar type of range, and it has the notion of being from a city. Don't be like a country bumpkin who's totally uncultured. Now, there is a proviso here. If the graciousness, the charis, the friendliness, the joy, isn't going to interfere with the frankness of speech, the criticism. So again, you've got to sort of like find the right balance between being critical and also, being pleasant in doing so with somebody. Now, he talks specifically about comic poets. And this is, very interesting that he brings this up. Here you need a little bit of background, I would say. So in ancient comic poetry, which would be put on stage. And this is the old comedy, not the new comedy. At a certain point of the play, the actors would actually take their masks off and they would harangue big, important people in the audience. You made the wrong decision on that vote that you did. This is the wrong policy. Look at you. You're chasing women and neglecting your wife. You drink too much or stuff like that. Now, Plutarch says that sometimes this would actually work, but, and again, he uses another culinary metaphor, like a vile dressing with food, the drollery and scurrility. So he uses again, galoion kai bomolochon, two words for like joking around. They're joking around in low-class ways. It made the frankness ineffective and useless. So there was nothing left for the authors but a name of malice and coarseness and no profit for the hearers for their words. Right? So sometimes joking around can get us into trouble. He also has another really great piece of advice here that I think some of us can probably relate to more than others, and I think it can be extended beyond just drinking wine or alcohol to any sort of intoxication whatsoever. So he says that in the midst of wine and hard drinking, we need to be on our guard against anything of this sort. Why? Well, because people's minds are perilously inclined to anger on account of the wine that they're drinking, and sometimes heavy drinking takes control of their frankness and it creates hatred between people, enmity. It takes people who are friends and makes them the opposite of friends. So this is a big problem. You shouldn't be engaging in frankness just because you're drunk. And he talks about people, we have this term liquid courage that we use sometimes in English. So he talks about people who can't really be frank with others unless they're tipsy or intoxicated. He says that's not good. You should be able to be sober and tell your friends what they need to hear. Now, this could be wine, this could be beer, this could be hard liquor, but this could just as well be using cocaine or other stimulants, amphetamines. This could be getting high with marijuana. This could be tripping on something. You probably shouldn't try to engage in frank speaking exclusively when you're using some sort of drug, right? He also talks about drawing comparisons to other people, which could be useful, but you've got to be careful with this, he says, because sometimes this is going to lead to us, getting contentious. Now, the word there, philonikia, is actually about love of victory. And he talks about it. It can be understood in a good way. It can be understood in a bad way too, kakia, right, as a vice. And so if we draw comparisons to other people, we can often make people competitive with each other. That might be counterproductive. Coming back to another point that he spends a lot of time on, we should think about who the potential audience is for the frank speaking. We're talking to one person, our friend, hopefully, who we are telling things that can be painful, that they don't want to hear, that they view as critical. Do we do this in front of an audience of other people that, it might be tactless to do this. So he talks about using frank speech towards a friend before a large company, right? So this could be in public, this could be before some group of people that they don't want to be criticized in front of. And there's a really interesting story here that he tells. Socrates had handled one of his acquaintances severely in a conversation which took place close by the money changers. So the money changers are, kind of a disreputable lot. Plato then says to Socrates, shouldn't you have said that in private? Now, they're still in front of the money changers, right? And Socrates says, well, wouldn't you have done better if you'd had addressed your remark to me in private? So both of them were kind of at fault in that. They probably shouldn't have been doing that in front of the money changers. And then Plutarch is going to talk about people that we really need to watch out in front of, right? So he talks about a husband in the hearing of his wife. We could extend this to any sort of spouses or romantic partners or, something where you're on the same level like that. Parents and children, upbraiding the parent in front of the children, it might actually be counterproductive. Maybe you need to take the parent aside and talk to them there. Lover and beloved. Now, you might say, well, isn't that the same as husband and wife or romantic relationship? So in ancient Greek society, there was this, sort of imbalanced relationship where the lover would typically be older and the beloved would be younger. And there was, all sorts of, baggage connected with it, we could say. Suffice it to say, if one person has erotic or romantic feelings towards another, and you're going to criticize that first person in front of the other person, it might not produce the result that you want. And then very interestingly, teacher and student. He thinks that you don't want to go into somebody's classroom, start criticizing the teacher in front of their class. Maybe you should do that privately, right? So why? Because people are driven, he says, almost insane with grief and anger at being taken to task before those with whom they feel it is necessary to stand well. Their sense of the relationship, their social status within it is being threatened by the criticism that is being offered. There's two other points that we need to stress as well. One of these is that we probably don't want to criticize too often, particularly if it's minor stuff. As he says, if you're always bickering over everything and about everything, and you approach your acquaintance in the manner not of a friend but a schoolmaster, admonitions lose their edge and effectiveness in matters of the highest importance. As we often say in English, you need to choose your battles. If you're going to criticize, don't nag about everything. Figure out what the most important things to criticize are, because otherwise you're going to render that frankness of speech ineffective over time. And then finally, he concludes the entire piece by talking about this metaphor of the physician. So the friend who uses free speech is like the physician using medicine. And medicine, particularly if we're talking about like surgery or purges or stuff like that, he talks about being given castor oil, which makes people evacuate themselves. Not a fun thing. He says, you don't just give your medicine and then take off and say, oh, hope you feel better. You need to stick around and help the person after you give the medicine of frank speaking. He says, they treat it with soothing lotions and fomentations. So, people who use admonition with skill, they don't simply apply its bitterness and sting and then run away. They further converse with gentle words and they mollify and assuage, right? And he says, the person who's been hard hit and scored by frankness, if they be left rough and timid and uneven, will, owing to the effect of anger, not readily respond to an appeal the next time or put up with attempts to soothe them. So it's really important, if you want to use frank speech with somebody to help them out as their friend, that you stick around afterwards and you don't speak to them as frankly, but you show a certain kind of gentleness. You soothe them. You show them that you actually do, in fact, care about them. So these are all a number of different ways in which frankness of speech, a great remedy against moral problems for Plutarch, all different ways in which it can be made moderate, within measure, in proportion, which will, over time, render it much more effective.